My opinion never changed, Vince. I worked
Hmm.
for him, worked there 7 years, worked with he and Pat. We work in the office all week, and then all of the creative was done on the weekends in Vince's home with a casual atmosphere. And in the summer times, we'd be out at the pool, and I watched Shane, and not Shane, not so much. He was off running with his buddies, but I watched Stephanie grow up because she would bring her other girls, and they were splashing and having a good time in the pool. And Vince had a cabana out there so that if it rained, we were covered, and he had a whole bank of phones. And he, Pat, and I basically that's how the company was run. And Vince had the final say on everything, which says it has to be structured that way. And Pat, Vince takes none of the blame for anything that didn't work out, and all the credit for everything that was successful. And that's just how it is. And Pat Patterson is probably the of all the people that I've been around and worked with, and I've been around some. I think of Eddie Graham as my mentor and a genius, but right up there was the people that came out of Florida, and they they were successful. And I lost my train of thought, but
As far as Pat.
Yeah, as far as Pat. Pat was there, and Pat had been around San Francisco with Stevens and worked for Shires. And Roy Shires, what little time I was around him, realized that he was a true genius too. And Pat was smart enough to be there. And so when later in his career, when Pat got involved in the creative side of it, he could sit with the talent and make an assessment or come up with a creative idea. And he would have the credibility because he wasn't speaking in theory. He had done it. All you had to do was look at the run that Stevens and Pat had in San Francisco with Shires. A hell of a run, and for years. And then it wasn't like something, this was the luck of being that right place at the right time. They went to Minneapolis and did the same thing again. And again, it's because Pat understood the big picture. He was a great in-ring performer. He was a great understander of talent, could deal with talent, and somebody who, I have so much respect for personally and professionally. And then with Vince, Pat he learned early on what Vince liked and didn't like. And he knew he would learn real quickly if he threw something out there and it just didn't fit with what Vince was comfortable with. Instead of Pat going to the trenches and getting into a fight with Vince to try and convince Vince that Pat was right and Vince was wrong, Pat was smart enough to not get into those situations. And he learned what Vince liked. And he then took and fed Vince what he liked by the shovelful. And it was, and we would sit there and we would go to TV, and we each had this great big ledger. Like if we were doing 3 towns a night, we would have all the towns on each page so that we would have a record there of who was there and everything. And then when we would do TV, Pat and I would sit in the back with our book open, and we would have, each of us would have our own way of little handwritten notes here and there. And Vince would sit up front, and he would have the final version of which we all had input in and agreed which Vince was most comfortable with. And then Pat and I would sit in the back, and Vince would run the entire show. And it wasn't like we needed to be up there at the table next to him or to try and send a message that, that we had a lot of input in whatever the final result was. That's not what my head was, and Pat either. we were just happy to be part of an incredibly successful run. And there were times where Vince would be up there with a book, and he would be telling all the people, like, all of this came from Vince's mind, which was fine. Pat was comfortable with that, and so was I. And sometimes, things would change, and this didn't happen with great regularity, but every now and then we would make a change for the better, and Vince, this was the last minute thing, he would forget to erase out something and write in what the best thing was that we decided to do. And all of a sudden, Vince would be doing the production meeting, and he would be putting out this thing that all of a sudden I'm looking at my book, and I look at Pat's looking at me, and it's like, what? You're on third base. We got the home plate and changes everything. So
Yep.
Pat or I would raise our hands and say, Vince, I just have a note here. I think that you decided that what you wanted to do was this, and that's what I wrote down. Then Vince would say, oh, yes, that's right. It was in my mind, and that's, yes, and I just forgot to write it down. Thank you for reminding me. and Pat and I, it wasn't about us getting, credit, and there were people there that probably figured out what was going on, but I would say 95% of them looked at Vince, and then, like I say, he had that reputation of being the genius, and Pat and I were fine with that. We had job security, we were doing well financially, and it just was a system that worked out very smooth.
That is a great system. You agree, and it's very simplistic, and it's funny that you guys were, for a long time, the number one in organization, making so much money. It was very simplistic, and they kind of got away from that for a while. That's for sure. Is there, like you said, as far as hanging out with Vince at his house and doing creative on the weekends and hanging out in the pool and things like that, is there an actual way to be close to Vince McMahon? Like, obviously, you're working with him very tight, but like on a personal level, is there a way to get close to him?
I never really thought of it that way. I mean, we would be in the office all week, and Vince was hands-on in everything. If we had a pay-per-view and they were going to do a poster, that poster wouldn't go until Vince came in and looked at it, and a lot of times he'd say, okay, that's fine, or I want to take that out and I want to put this in. I mean, he had final say on everything. So it's not like Pat and I were doing it and Vince was taking the credit. No, Vince was hands-on and the final say on everything. And Pat and I were just two guys that had a lot of experience, and Pat in particular understood Vince's likes and dislikes. And so between the three of us, it was a system that really, really worked very, very well. And there were good times for me. We were working 7 days a week, and what was funny was we would finish Friday, and then Pat, I was married. Well, I got married when I was there, and I'd been living with my last wife at that time, and Pat and Louis Vandera was still there, and so Pat didn't really, it was like we would work all day with Vince, and I couldn't wait to get away because I would just be drained, and I would want to be home with my wife and enjoy a home-cooked meal and time with her and just kind of decompress. And we would do that all day, and I'm waiting, anxious to get home. And Pat would say to Vince, what are you doing tonight? Well, I don't have anything. I was going to go in and say, well, I'll join you. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, Pat, you're volunteering. And, of course, Vince, he'd love to have Pat's company. And I don't know. I needed, I guess balance is the word that I'm trying to come up with. I needed some balance. I didn't mind working 7 days a week, but there were times where I wanted, and what would happen was we we would be doing TV starting Monday, and we would work Saturday, and we would have 3 weeks of TV that we were going to do Monday. One show that was live, and then the other two we were going to tape for the following weeks, and that's back when it was like 3 week cycles. And we would start with blank papers. We'd have 3 blank papers, and we would get out there all day Saturday, and Vince he wouldn't want to immediately go to those 3 weeks. And I learned a lot from Vince, because what I learned to do was I'd have a roster of the heels and baby faces, kind of like if you're a baseball manager, you want to have it's like here's your team roster. So as you're plugging stuff in, and especially when you're booking like an A show and you got 2 other towns that are B's or a BC, you would put 2 main events in the big town, and then you need a good main event in the other 2 towns, and then the smaller the town, the less strength you would need under it. And in the big town, you had to understand how to balance all of that. And Pat and I worked very well together because we understood the concept, and it was easy to give Vince ideas and present things, and finally come up with something that he was very comfortable with. And I think the success of the business for the time that we were there speaks for itself, and how well that formula worked for us. But when we were doing TV, we would get there Saturday and have 3 weeks of TV, 3 blank sheets. And Vince's MO was, well, I'd like to look ahead and then work backwards. So here we are, Royal Rumble time. He's looking at WrestleMania the following year. And he's want to, in his own mind, have a vision of what he thinks his main event is going to be. And then that determines what you're going to do with, with your other major, because there were like 4 major pay-per-views, and that's before they got into the monthlies. And then you could, if we do that at WrestleMania, we could do this at this, and we could do this at SummerSlam, and he would work backwards, which made sense in that you at least have a plan. The only problem is that if you're using the Ultimate Warrior as an example, and you've got, we could have work with him here, and we could do the build up with this match here, and and work back, and then the Warrior would do something crazy and get fired in the Garden, and all of that dialogue, all of that brain think,
oh my God,
all of it start all over, and it takes a special mindset to, some people would say you put so much energy and you finally, after 3 or 4 days, got this, and now it's useless. You got to start all over. And that could be very discouraging. But Pat and I had been in the business long enough that we understood the nature of the business, that either somebody got fired or somebody got hurt serious enough that they were going to be out 6 months. And if they were a key player, it's okay. How are we going to adjust to that? How are we going to? We still got to draw in the meantime. So it was a challenge, and it also was something that not everybody could do. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but it took people like Pat. And I look at Pat as probably the greatest mind that I ever worked with, because he could do that. He had the vision, and yet he could also be in the main event and perform. Pat could do it all. He was to be the greatest, and it was a good time for me. But I would come home Saturday, and we wouldn't have the TVs written. And when we would leave, a lot of times we would stay, and then we would be drained, and Vince would say, well, have dinner, stay here. And he had a housekeeper, Mary, that an Oriental woman that was a great cook, and most of those weekends I would a lot of times Pat would leave and go because he would have dinner plans with Louis, and I would stay and be invited and have dinner with he and Linda, and a lot of Shane wasn't there very often, nor was Stephanie, and just have dinner. And so I got to be around Vince and have a relationship with him socially in the sense that yes, we had a business relationship, but he and I could laugh and have a good time and really talk about anything and everything. And they were great memories for me.